Everyone trusted him. That trust is exactly how the crimes lasted so long. For years, this man stood at the pulpit and spoke about forgiveness. What no one knew was what he was hiding. For decades, John Geoghan was not a name spoken aloud. In parish records, he appeared as a priest, transferred from one church to another. In internal files, his movements were documented with calm language: reassignment, medical leave, administrative adjustment. To the families who trusted him, he was a man of God. To the children who encountered him, he was something else entirely. And to the institution that knew what he was doing, he was a problem to be managed, not a crime to be reported. John Geoghan was ordained as a Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Boston in the early 1960s. He served in multiple parishes across Massachusetts over the course of 3 decades. On the surface, his career looked ordinary, quiet, stable, faithful. But behind closed doors, complaints followed him like a shadow. As early as the 1970s, church officials received reports that Geoghan had sexually abused children. The accusations were not vague. Parents came forward. Victims spoke. Concerns were documented. What did not happen is what defines this case. There were no police reports. There were no warnings to congregations. There were no public consequences. Instead, Geoghan was moved, again and again, from one parish to another, often into communities with schools, youth programs, and altar servers. Each transfer came without disclosure. Each new assignment placed him in contact with fresh victims. The church kept records, but not the kind meant to protect children. Internal correspondence later revealed that church leadership knew Geoghan posed a danger. Psychologists consulted by the church warned that he was likely to Settlements were quietly paid to families who agreed to remain silent. Files were sealed. Complaints were labeled resolved. Resolved meant hidden. By the time the truth began to surface publicly, Geoghan had been accused of abusing over 130 children, making him one of the most prolific abusers in modern American history. For the victims, the abuse often followed a similar pattern. Geoghan targeted boys, many from working-class or immigrant Catholic families. He used his authority to gain access, offering rides, private meetings, overnight trips. The collar protected him. Parents trusted him because the church told them to. Children did not have language for what was happening. When some tried to speak, they were dismissed, blamed, or simply not believed. Others stayed silent for decades, carrying the damage alone. Inside the archdiocese, the response was not ignorance, it was strategy. Documents later made public showed that high-ranking officials, including Cardinal Bernard Law, were aware of the allegations. Instead of reporting Geoghan to law enforcement, they approved transfers. When pressure mounted, Geoghan was sent to church-run treatment centers, not to remove him from access to children, but to manage the risk quietly. Records were kept internally. Law enforcement was kept out. If you follow real stories where faith and power collide, this channel is for you. In 1994, after years of abuse and growing complaints, Geoghan was finally removed from parish work. But even then, the church did not alert the public to why. He was placed in a supervised residence, still under church authority. It would take another 8 years for the full truth to explode into public view. In 2002, investigative reporting by the Boston Globe uncovered thousands of internal church documents showing a systemic pattern of abuse and cover-up within the Archdiocese of Boston. Geoghan's case became the centerpiece. The records showed exactly how the institution had responded, not by stopping the abuse, but by relocating it. The revelations shook the world. Survivors came forward in waves. Many learned, for the first time, that their abuser had hurt dozens of others, and that the church had known all along. The sense of betrayal was total. John Geoghan was arrested and charged. In 2002, he was convicted of child molestation and sentenced to prison. For many victims, the conviction was not closure, it was confirmation. Confirmation that what happened was real. Confirmation that they had not imagined it. Confirmation that the church had chosen secrecy over safety. But even justice came with a cruel footnote. In 2003, while serving his sentence, John Geoghan was beaten to death in prison by another inmate. He died without ever facing trial for the vast majority of his alleged crimes. For survivors, the anger shifted direction. Geoghan was gone, but the institution remained. Cardinal Bernard Law resigned later that year, amid global outrage, but faced no criminal charges. He relocated to Rome, where he was given a prestigious ceremonial role at the Vatican. The message was unmistakable. The man who committed the abuse died in prison. The men who concealed it retired with honor. The aftermath for Boston was devastating. Parishes closed, lawsuits multiplied, settlements reached hundreds of millions of dollars, faith communities fractured, trust collapsed. For survivors, the damage was not only physical or psychological, it was existential. Many had built their lives around the church. Speaking out meant losing family support, spiritual identity, and community belonging. And for decades, the records that could have stopped the abuse had existed. They were just never used to protect children. They were used to protect the institution. This case did not reveal a single criminal. It revealed a system where documentation replaced accountability, where silence was treated as pastoral care, and where the reputation of the church outweighed the lives of the vulnerable. The records were erased, sealed, or buried in filing cabinets, but the victims remained. They remained with trauma. They remained with unanswered questions. They remained long after the institution moved on. And the most haunting truth of all is this: if the records had been handed to police instead of lawyers, if the warnings had been shared instead of hidden, if faith had not been used as a shield, hundreds of children would have been spared. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For years, Theodore McCarrick was the public face of American Catholicism. He moved icily through corridors of power, shaking hands with presidents, advising popes, raising millions of dollars for the church. He was articulate, charming, and relentlessly visible. To the public, he was a respected cardinal. To the Vatican, he was a trusted envoy. And to those who knew the truth, he was a secret everyone protected. Theodore Edgar McCarrick was ordained in 1958. From the beginning, he demonstrated an extraordinary ability to rise. He cultivated donors. He networked strategically. He presented himself as tireless in service and deeply loyal to church authority. Those qualities insulated him. Behind the image, allegations followed him quietly for decades. As early as the 1970s, seminarians accused McCarrick of sexual misconduct. Young men described being invited to his beach house, where he would insist they sleep in the same bed with him. He framed the arrangement as harmless, a sign of closeness, a test of trust. Refusal came with consequences. Seminarians understood that McCarrick had influence over their futures. He controlled recommendations, assignments, and advancement. Saying no meant risking everything they had sacrificed for. Complaints reached bishops. Whispers circulated in files were created. Nothing reached the police. Instead, the church handled McCarrick internally and discreetly. Settlements were paid. Confidentiality agreements were signed. Records were sealed. Despite repeated warnings, McCarrick's career accelerated. He became Archbishop of Newark, then Archbishop of Washington, D.C. in 2001. He was elevated to cardinal, one of the most powerful positions in the church. At every stage, information existed that should have stopped him. Internal documents later revealed that Vatican officials were aware of allegations long before his promotion. Reports describe patterns of behavior. Names were attached. Evidence was present. But McCarrick was useful. He raised money. He represented the church diplomatically. He knew how to navigate politics. So the records stayed buried. In 2006, McCarrick retired from his official post, but remained active. He traveled internationally as an informal Vatican representative. He continued to be treated as an elder statesman. Then, in 2018, the silence finally collapsed. A former altar boy accused McCarrick of sexually abusing him decades earlier. The allegation was deemed credible by the Archdiocese of New York. Suddenly, the church could no longer contain the damage. As journalists dug deeper, a devastating pattern emerged. Multiple bishops had known. Multiple Vatican officers had been informed. Restrictions placed on McCarrick had been informal and unenforced. He was told to live quietly and ignored it. He was warned and continued. The Vatican released a detailed report confirming decades of knowledge and inaction. It acknowledged that records existed and that leadership failed to act decisively. McCarrick was laicized, removed from the priesthood in 2019. It was unprecedented, but criminal accountability came slowly. In 2021, McCarrick was charged with sexual assault in Massachusetts. Due to his age and health, many charges were dismissed. He was later deemed unfit to stand trial in other jurisdictions. He died in 2024, never having served prison time. For survivors, the outcome was devastating but familiar. They had spoken, they had documented, they had waited, and still, Justice arrived too late, if it arrived at all. What makes the McCarrick case especially chilling is how modern it was. This was not the 1950s. This was not an era of ignorance. This was a time of safeguarding policies, legal obligations, and global scrutiny. And still, power prevailed. Records were kept but not used. Warnings were issued but not enforced. Truth was acknowledged only when denial became impossible. The church did not lack information. It lacked courage. And while leaders debated process, victims carried trauma for decades, isolated, disbelieved, and watching their abuser ascend. The files that could have ended McCarrick's career early were hidden in archives. The decisions that could have protected others were deferred. The accountability that mattered was postponed until time itself became a shield. The records were erased slowly, quietly, and the victims remained. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For years, Paul Shanley was celebrated as a reformer. He was the priest who spoke about inclusion, the priest who claimed to stand with the marginalized, the priest who challenged the church from within, or so it seemed. Behind the image, children were being abused, and when the warnings came, they were not ignored by accident. They were erased by design. Paul Shanley was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1960, and became well known in Boston for his outspoken views. He publicly criticized church hierarchy, advocated controversial positions, and built a reputation as a progressive voice. That reputation became his camouflage. Parents trusted him because he seemed different. Church officials tolerated him because he drew attention away from deeper scrutiny. But long before his public persona took shape, allegations were already circulating. As early as the 1960s, complaints emerged that Shanley had sexually abused children. The accusations were specific. Names were attached. Patterns were described. The church knew. Internal records later revealed that bishops were aware of Shanley's behavior with minors. He was described as a risk. Psychologists consulted by the church warned that he posed a danger to children, and yet, he was allowed to continue. Shanley was repeatedly reassigned, often into roles that placed him in direct contact with vulnerable youth. He worked with troubled teens. He had access to children seeking counseling, guidance, or refuge. Each move came quietly. Each transfer came without warning to families. Each reassignment created new victims. Survivors later described how Shanley used ideological language to manipulate them. Abuse was framed as care. Boundaries were dismissed as outdated morality. Children were made to believe they were complicit, or even responsible. When some victims tried to speak, the response was familiar. They were not believed. They were told they misunderstood. They were told not to ruin a priest's life. The church's internal response followed a consistent pattern. Concerns were documented. Files were created. Action was avoided. Shanley remained in ministry for decades. It was not until the early 2000s, during the same wave of investigations that exposed John Geoghan, that Shanley's history finally became public. Journalists uncovered records showing that church leaders had long known of allegations against him, and had chosen to keep him active. The documents were devastating. They showed deliberate decisions to protect the institution. They showed warnings ignored. They showed children sacrificed to preserve reputation. In 2002, Paul Shanley was charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse involving minors. Survivors testified about abuse that occurred when they were children decades earlier. In 2005, Shanley was convicted and sentenced to prison. For survivors, the conviction came with mixed emotions. Justice had arrived, but only after years of silence, denial, and damage. Many had waited their entire adult lives to be believed. Some had struggled with addiction, broken relationships, and mental illness rooted in childhood trauma. And still, no church official faced criminal charges for enabling the abuse. The records told the story clearly. The church had known. The church had documented. The church had chosen concealment. Shanley was eventually released from prison due to declining health. He died in 2018. His death closed one chapter, but not the larger wound. Because this case was never just about one man. It was about how image can be weaponized, how dissent can be used as disguise, how institutions learn to manage risk instead of stopping harm. The erasure here was not total destruction of files. It was selective memory. Documents were buried in archives. Complaints were abuse was treated as an internal issue rather than a crime. And time did the rest. Memories faded. Evidence aged. Survivors carried the burden alone. until the truth forced its way out. The victims remained long after the church hoped the records would disappear. They remained with the knowledge that their pain had been avoidable. They remained knowing that protection was offered, just not to them. And the lesson is as brutal as it is simple. When records exist, but are never acted upon, silence becomes policy, and abuse becomes inevitable. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Michael Clare carried himself like a man who had personally negotiated with heaven. In the Bronx, New York, he was a spiritual authority whose words seemed to grip people by the heart. His church, Fellowship Tabernacle Church, sat quietly on a street lined with small stores, modest apartments, and the unrelenting hum of city life. But inside its doors, Pastor Michael Clare commanded the atmosphere like a conductor. His sermons were dramatic, emotionally charged, and full of declarations about purity, righteousness, and the dangers of immorality. People cried during his altar calls. They lined up for counseling sessions. Women sought his guidance. Families asked for his blessings. Children admired him. He crafted an identity so polished that to question him felt like questioning God. But behind the pulpit, behind the prayers, behind the robe and the softened tone of spiritual compassion, existed a predator who used scripture as camouflage. Pastor Michael Clare had long understood the psychology of trust. He recognized that when people were hurting, desperate, or longing for guidance, they became vulnerable. And instead of protecting that vulnerability as a pastor, he exploited it. His entire approach to leadership revolved around power, gaining it, maintaining it, and using it to manipulate the most impressionable members of his congregation. His downfall began with a teenager who saw him not as a pastor, but as a father figure. She came from a family that had been struggling emotionally, financially, spiritually. Pastor Michael Clare inserted himself into that void with ease. He offered counseling, support, direction. He offered rides home, extra Bible study, personal attention. He created a dynamic in which the teenager felt chosen, seen, valued in a way she never had before. And then he corrupted it. According to testimony later revealed in court, the pastor's grooming was subtle at first. He framed inappropriate interactions as spiritual growth. He reframed discomfort as tests of obedience. He layered religious justification over every boundary he crossed, convincing her that resisting him meant resisting God's will. He turned his spiritual authority into a weapon, one he wielded behind closed doors while telling the congregation he was a protector of virtue. The abuse continued for years, hidden beneath sermons about purity. During that time, no one suspected him. He was charismatic, confident, articulate. He visited the sick, attended funerals, performed weddings, and baptized children. He spoke with authority at regional church gatherings. He had a reputation for helping troubled youths. The church community saw him as someone who gave tirelessly of himself. But predators often hide in plain sight. It wasn't until the victim confided in someone outside the church that cracks finally appeared in his facade. The individual contacted authorities, and the Bronx law enforcement began investigating quietly. Detectives from NYPD Special Victims Division reviewed the allegations and interviewed the victim multiple times to confirm consistency. What they found was a disturbing pattern, one that showed meticulous grooming, psychological manipulation, and spiritual coercion. Once they had enough preliminary evidence, detectives approached Pastor Michael Clare. He denied everything, immediately shifting into pastor mode, quoting scripture, claiming the devil sought to destroy him, insisting he was under attack because of his powerful ministry. To his congregation, he presented himself as a persecuted holy man. He suggested that the girl was confused, perhaps mentally unwell, perhaps influenced by sinful forces. Some believed him without hesitation. Others felt uneasy but remained silent. Silence is a predator's ally. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors subpoenaed church records, counseling schedules, communication logs, and witness testimonies. They discovered that the victim wasn't the only one he had isolated. Several people from the congregation came forward with accounts of the pastor's inappropriate behavior, touches that lingered too long, comments that blurred boundaries, and manipulations disguised as spiritual rebukes. Though only one victim's case moved forward initially, the pattern became increasingly clear. Authorities arrested the pastor, and the news spread quickly. Outlets like CBS New York and New York Daily News reported the arrest, shocking the Bronx community. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, supporters insisting he was innocent, others demanding justice. Church members cried, not only for the victim but also for the collapse of the image they believed in. At trial, prosecutors presented their evidence with precision. They detailed the timeline of the abuse, how the pastor had targeted the girl, how he used religious authority to control her, how he manipulated her fears, and how he isolated her from people who might have protected her. They brought in digital forensics. They brought in church members who had observed suspicious behavior. They brought in expert witnesses who explained the psychological mechanisms of grooming. And then the victim took the stand. Her voice trembled, but she spoke with clarity. She described how the pastor's authority overpowered her ability to resist, how he invoked God to justify his actions, how he framed obedience as holiness, how he told her that speaking out would curse her family. Her testimony pierced the courtroom's protective shell. Even those who had initially supported the pastor now listened with widened eyes. Pastor Michael Clare showed no remorse during the proceedings. His demeanor oscillated between indignation, self-righteous confidence, and cold dismissal. He claimed he was being framed. He claimed the girl misunderstood. He claimed everything prosecutors presented had been fabricated by individuals under satanic influence. But the evidence was damning. The jury deliberated, and the verdict was swift. He was found guilty on multiple felony charges, including predatory sexual assault and endangering the welfare of a child. When the judge announced the sentence, a lengthy prison term reflecting the severity of his crimes, the courtroom felt a mixture of relief, grief, and disbelief. Some congregants cried for the victim. Others cried because their worldview had been shattered. A few walked out silently, unable to reconcile their faith with the betrayal. And some supporters still maintained that the pastor was innocent, refusing to acknowledge the overwhelming evidence. Pastor Michael Clare was led away in handcuffs, no longer a spiritual giant but a convicted predator. In the aftermath, the congregation split. Some left the church forever, traumatized by the realization that they had unknowingly supported a predator. Others stayed, determined to rebuild. Leadership changed. Safeguards were implemented. Background checks, mandatory reporting training, open-door counseling policies. The church pledged transparency, but the scars remained. Outside the church walls, the case became a pivotal example of how spiritual authority can mask predatory behavior. Advocates for victims of religious abuse pointed to the case as evidence of the need for stronger oversight within religious institutions. Former congregants gave interviews about how easily they had been manipulated by a man they trusted completely. The victim's life changed forever. With the support of family, law enforcement, and trauma counselors, she slowly rebuilt her sense of identity. Though the emotional damage ran deep, her courage had prevented further harm to others. Her story empowered other survivors to come forward in unrelated cases across New York. Her bravery illuminated the darkness that Pastor Michael Clare had hidden beneath his pastoral robe. In prison, the pastor maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen. He conducted Bible studies behind bars. He insisted he had been persecuted, but no amount of denial could change the truth that emerged in court. The community, however, struggled with the lingering question that arises in every case like this. How did a predator stand on a stage, preach about morality, and go unnoticed for so long? The answer lay partly in the pastor's charisma, partly in his strategic manipulation, and partly in the congregation's willingness to believe the best of a man who presented himself as a spiritual authority. Predators like him thrive when no one dares question the person who claims to speak for God. In the years after his conviction, the Bronx community used the case as a wake-up call. Parents taught their children to question inappropriate behavior from a nigh adult. Even religious leaders, churches re-evaluated their counseling policies. Pastors were reminded that authority is not immunity, and the story of Pastor Michael Clare became a warning whispered across pulpits, youth groups, and family meetings. Holiness is not proven by titles, robes, or sermons. It is proven by actions, and sometimes the people who preach the loudest are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. For the community he once guided, the truth left behind a haunting reminder. A predator can disguise himself as a shepherd. A sermon can hide a lie. A pastor can become the villain. And behind the mask of faith, the most dangerous sins can thrive unseen. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Ulf Ekman stood at the center of one of Scandinavia's most influential modern Christian movements, a pastor whose voice shaped tens of thousands of believers across Sweden and Europe. Charismatic, articulate, and fiercely confident, Ekman preached about divine authority, spiritual warfare, and the rewards of obedience. For many followers, he was not just a preacher, he was a prophet. But beneath the polished sermons and global conferences was a slow-burning corruption of power, money, and control that would leave an entire faith community fractured and betrayed. Born in 1950 in Sweden, Ekman trained in theology before encountering the American Word of Faith movement in the late 1970s. What he absorbed there would define his ministry: prosperity doctrine, unquestioned pastoral authority, and the belief that spiritual leaders were divinely appointed and therefore beyond ordinary criticism. When Ekman returned to Sweden, he brought this ideology with him, an approach that clashed sharply with the country's traditionally restrained Lutheran culture. In 1983, Ekman founded Word of Life, Livets Ord, in Uppsala. What began as a small charismatic congregation rapidly evolved into a powerful religious institution, complete with its own Bible school, publishing arm, global missions, and media presence. Ekman's sermons were intense and authoritative. He claimed spiritual insight into world events, personal destinies, and divine will. Followers were taught that obedience to leadership was obedience to God. Money played a central role from the beginning. Congregants were encouraged, often pressured, to give generously, framed not just as charity but as spiritual investment. Financial sacrifice was linked to divine blessing. Doubt was framed as spiritual weakness. Former members later recalled being urged to take loans, donate inheritances, and prioritize church giving over personal stability. Ekman insisted that prosperity would follow faith, and that questioning the flow of money demonstrated distrust in God. Critics soon emerged, warning that Word of Life operated more like a corporation than a church. Financial transparency was limited. Leadership decision-making was centralized around Ekman and a small inner circle. Dissenters were marginalized, labeled rebellious, or accused of spiritual failure. Yet the movement continued to grow, attracting international attention and political connections. By the 1990s, Word of Life had become deeply entangled in global missionary work, including controversial operations in Eastern Europe and parts of the former Soviet Union. Ekman publicly aligned himself with authoritarian regimes he believed supported Christian values, downplaying human rights concerns in favor of ideological alignment. These choices disturbed observers, who questioned whether faith was being used to justify proximity to power rather than moral accountability. Inside the movement, former insiders describe an atmosphere of fear masked as devotion. Questioning leadership was dangerous not legally, but spiritually. Members were warned that leaving the church could invite divine punishment or personal ruin. Relationships outside the movement were discouraged. Ekman's voice dominated not only sermons, but personal decisions involving marriage, career, and family. As years passed, scandals quietly mounted. Former Bible school students came forward describing psychological manipulation, coercive practices, and emotional abuse. Some reported that Ekman's teachings fostered guilt, dependency, and identity loss. Others spoke about authoritarian discipline disguised as spiritual correction. While criminal charges were rare, the ethical damage was profound. Then came the moment that shattered the movement. In 2014, without warning, Ulf Ekman announced his departure, not just from Word of Life, but from Protestantism entirely. He revealed that he was converting to Roman Catholicism. For tens of thousands of followers who had been taught that Catholicism was doctrinally corrupt, spiritually dangerous, and fundamentally wrong, the announcement was devastating. The shock was not theological, it was existential. Ekman had spent decades presenting his spiritual authority as divinely inspired and unquestionably correct. He had demanded loyalty, sacrifice, and obedience based on that authority. Now, without apology, he declared that he had been wrong. Not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong. Former followers described the experience as spiritual whiplash. If Ekman had been mistaken about core truths, what else had been built on illusion? What had their sacrifices been for? Where did responsibility lie for the years of financial pressure, emotional control, and fractured relationships? Ekman offered no systematic reckoning. He did not address accusations of manipulation. He did not invite independent investigation. He framed his conversion as a personal journey guided by God. leaving followers to reconcile decades of absolute claims with sudden humility. For many, this silent retreat felt like abandonment. In Sweden, journalists began revisiting Word of Life's past. Reports highlighted the lack of accountability, the culture of submission, and the human toll on former members. Mental health professionals noted patterns common to high-control religious movements: loss of autonomy, fear-based loyalty, and difficulties reintegrating into society after leaving. Though Ekman was never convicted of financial crimes, his case exposes another form of corruption, one that hides behind legality: the corruption of influence, the moral breach of demanding total trust while refusing total accountability, the sin of shaping lives irrevocably without owning the consequences. Word of Life continues to exist today, though in a transformed and diminished state. Many leaders distanced themselves from Ekman's legacy. Others quietly left. A generation of believers was left questioning not only a pastor, but the very concept of spiritual authority. The story of Ulf Ekman is not about handcuffs or prison sentences. It is about the damage done when faith becomes centralized around one man's certainty, when obedience replaces conscience, when questioning is treated as betrayal. He preached heaven with conviction. He demanded belief without doubt. And yet, when the foundation cracked, he walked away from the structure he built, leaving his followers to sift through the rubble alone. The chilling reality is this: corruption does not always end in scandal. Sometimes it ends in silence, unanswered questions, and a generation struggling to rebuild trust after surrendering it completely. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the quiet Swedish village of Knutby, surrounded by forests and farmland, few residents imagined their community would become synonymous with one of Europe's most disturbing religious crime cases. Knutby was a place of order, routine, and deep Lutheran tradition. Exactly the kind of environment where faith carried weight and authority figures were rarely questioned. At the center of that environment stood Pastor Helge Fossmo, a man who preached devotion, obedience, and divine purpose while orchestrating manipulation, abuse, and ultimately, murder. Born in 1971, Fossmo did not begin his life as a monster in the public eye. He was intelligent, articulate, and deeply interested in theology. In the late 1990s, he became associated with the Knutby Philadelphia congregation, a Pentecostal group that had gradually drifted away from mainstream religious oversight. What distinguished Knutby was not just its doctrine, but its intensity. Members lived close to one another, worshipped together constantly, and submitted deeply personal aspects of their lives to church leadership. At the heart of Knutby's belief system was the idea that God communicated directly through chosen individuals. This belief became the gateway through which Fossmo would exercise absolute control. By the early 2000s, Fossmo had risen to become one of the congregation's most influential pastors. He positioned himself as spiritually enlightened, capable of interpreting divine will with clarity others lacked. Members were encouraged to trust him completely, to surrender doubt as a sign of humility. Questioning leadership was framed as rebellion, not against the church, but against God himself. This atmosphere of submission allowed Fossmo to begin a pattern of exploitation that went undetected for years. Privately, Fossmo engaged in multiple secret sexual relationships with women within the congregation, many of whom were emotionally vulnerable and spiritually dependent. He justified these relationships using scripture twisted into personal prophecy. Women were told their suffering was divinely ordained, that obedience, even when painful, would lead to spiritual growth. Guilt and fear were constant tools in his control. One of the most disturbing aspects of Fossmo's behavior was how he communicated. He used anonymous text messages claiming they were messages from God or angels to command and manipulate members. These messages urged obedience, justified suffering, and reinforced his authority. What recipients believed were divine instructions were, in reality, carefully crafted messages sent by Fossmo himself. The psychological damage was profound. Members began to experience constant anxiety, fear of divine punishment, and disconnection from their own moral instincts. Choices were no longer personal, they were spiritual tests administered by invisible authority. Fossmo had effectively inserted himself into the minds of his followers, reshaping their sense of reality. The situation escalated dramatically in January 2004. In Knutby, Alexandra Fossmo, Helge Fossmo's wife, was found shot dead in her home. Not long after, another woman was seriously wounded in a separate shooting. The community was thrown into panic. Violence of this kind was unprecedented. Initially, Fossmo appeared to be a grieving husband, devastated but faithful. Few suspected the truth. Police investigations soon unraveled a far darker story. The shooter was identified as Sarah Svensson, a young woman deeply embedded in the congregation, one of Fossmo's most manipulated followers. During interrogation, Svensson revealed that she believed God had commanded her to kill. Her actions, she insisted, were not her own will but divine obedience. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the horrifying mechanism behind those commands. The so-called messages from God were text messages sent by Helge Fossmo. He had groomed Svensson psychologically over years, breaking down her autonomy and filling the void with false divine narrative. Through constant reinforcement, emotional isolation, and religious manipulation, Fossmo convinced her that committing murder was an act of faith. Alexandra Fossmo's death was not random. It was a calculated step in a larger pattern of control. Evidence revealed that Fossmo wanted his wife out of the way so he could pursue other relationships within the congregation, free from scrutiny. Rather than divorce something that would have damaged his image, he chose secrecy, spiritual coercion and manipulation leading to homicide. The revelation shocked Sweden. When Fossmo was arrested and charged, the case dominated national and international media. Court proceedings exposed a level of psychological abuse rarely seen so explicitly in religious contexts. Prosecutors laid out how Fossmo exploited faith, authority, and mental vulnerability to bend others to his will. Text messages were read aloud in court commands framed as divine law, slowly escalating from obedience to violence. In 2004, Helge Fossmo was convicted of instigating the murder of his wife and attempted murder of another woman. He received life imprisonment, a sentence reflecting both the severity of the crime and the extreme betrayal of trust involved. Sarah Svensson was convicted as well, though her sentence reflected recognition of the profound psychological manipulation she had endured. For former members of Pulpit Philadelphia, the trial was only the beginning of the aftermath. Many struggled to reconcile their memories with the truth. Relationships within the community collapsed. Parents questioned how they could have allowed their children to grow under such influence. Survivors described long-term trauma, panic disorders, nightmares, loss of identity, and an inability to trust not only religious leaders but their own judgment. Experts later classified Pulpit as a high-control religious environment, noting classic signs of cult dynamics, isolation, authoritarian leadership, suppression of dissent, and use of fear to enforce obedience. What made the case particularly chilling was how subtle and normalized the control had been wrapped in scripture, tradition, and community values. The church in Sweden faced intense scrutiny. How could such an environment exist without external intervention? Why were warning signs ignored? Critics argued that the fear of appearing intolerant toward religious expression allowed abuse to flourish unchecked. Years later, Fossmo continued to draw attention from prison. Reports emerged that he attempted to exert spiritual influence, even behind bars, raising new concerns about the durability of manipulative personalities once authority has been tasted. The Pulpit case stands as one of Europe's clearest examples of belief weaponized into violence. This was not a crime of passion or rage, it was a crime of doctrine and control. Fossmo did not pull the trigger himself. He didn't need to. He had already reshaped another person's mind to do it for him. The deeper tragedy is not only that lives were lost, but that faith itself was used as the tool of destruction. The very system meant to guide morality became a mechanism for erasing it. When pastors preach heaven but live in sin, the fallout does not end at betrayal. It can escalate to annihilation. Trust becomes leverage, belief becomes a weapon, and the most terrifying realization follows. Evil does not always reject faith. Sometimes it studies it, then bends it to serve its darkest purpose. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more than 4 decades, Father Fernando Karadima was one of the most powerful and influential priests in Chile, a spiritual gatekeeper whose approval could determine who rose within the Catholic hierarchy and who remained invisible. From the outside, he appeared almost saintly, elderly, soft-spoken, deeply devout. Young seminarians sought him out, parents trusted him unquestioningly, and bishops shielded him instinctively. Yet behind the walls of his parish, faith was being twisted into a system of domination that left generations of men spiritually shattered. Born in 1930, Karadima entered the priesthood young and quickly established himself at El Bosque parish in Santiago, a wealthy and influential district. From this position, he cultivated more than followers, he cultivated protégés. Young men with aspirations for priesthood were drawn to him, believing proximity to Karadima meant proximity to God. He presented himself as a spiritual father, healer, and moral compass. What he actually offered was control. Karadima's influence did not come from overt force. It came from proximity to power and the mystique of holiness. He discouraged external friendships, encouraged isolation, and fostered intense emotional dependency. Confession became surveillance. Spiritual guidance became leverage. Obedience was framed as the highest virtue, and dissent as spiritual failure. Those closest to him were expected to submit entirely to his teachings, his interpretations of God's will, and eventually, his physical presence. The abuse followed a chillingly ritualized pattern. Victims later described being summoned for private meetings, framed as moments of grace or correction. Karadima blurred boundaries deliberately, using prolonged physical contact and invasive behavior while insisting it was spiritually purifying. Any discomfort was reframed as temptation or weakness. Victims were told their reactions proved moral deficiency, not wrongdoing by the priest. Fear ruled everything. Karadima warned victims that speaking out would destroy the church, damn their souls, or ruin their future vocation. He convinced many that silence was holiness and endurance was obedience. Some were told directly that reporting abuse would mark them as liars, sinners, or enemies of God. What made Karadima especially dangerous was not just his behavior, but his network. He mentored future bishops. He influenced Vatican appointments. This meant that when victims eventually tried to speak, their complaints were filtered through disciples who owed their careers to the man being accused. Investigations stalled, reports vanished. Accusations were dismissed as misunderstandings or spiritual attacks. For years, nothing happened. The damage compounded in silence. Victims struggled with depression, addiction, and shattered identities. Some abandoned religious life entirely. Others stayed, trapped by guilt and fear. Their suffering was invisible, absorbed into a system that prioritized reputation over truth. It wasn't until the 2000s that the barrier finally cracked. Survivors, now adults, joined forces and went public. Their testimonies were detailed, consistent, and devastating. They spoke not just of abuse, but of systematic psychological control. The stories spread beyond Chile, carried by journalists who traced Karadima's reach through church hierarchies like roots beneath the soil. The Vatican could no longer ignore it. In 2011, following internal investigation, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith found Karadima guilty of abuse of minors and abuse of power. The punishment, however, stunned many. Rather than prison, Karadima was sentenced to a life of prayer and penance, effectively house arrest within a convent. To survivors, it felt like another betrayal. The scandal detonated outward. Attention turned to Karadima's protégés, men who had defended him, dismissed victims, and obstructed justice. Among them were influential Chilean bishops who would later face resignations amid mounting pressure. Trust in the Catholic Church in Chile collapsed almost overnight. Public outrage reached historic levels. Demonstrations filled the streets. Churches emptied. Victims demanded accountability, not only for Karadima, but for every official who enabled him. The case became emblematic of global clerical abuse, proof that corruption did not always take the form of rogue individuals, but of institutional complicity. Karadima remained defiant until the end. He denied wrongdoing, expressed no remorse, and died in 2021 without ever confronting his victims directly. For many survivors, his death was not closure, it was confirmation that justice delayed is often justice denied. The enduring damage, however, could not be buried with him. Chile's relationship with religious authority changed permanently. Faith gave way to skepticism. Obedience gave way to scrutiny. The image of sanctity that once protected abusers was irreparably cracked. Father Fernando Karadima preached holiness, discipline, and devotion. He inspired vocations and shaped careers, but behind that image, he built a system of fear that used God as justification and silence as currency. His story reveals a darker truth about corruption in religion. Sometimes the greatest crimes are committed not loudly, but gently through whispered guidance, trusted authority, and years of silence enforced by fear. When pastors preach heaven but live in sin, the damage is not confined to victims alone. It radiates outward, poisoning institutions, destroying trust, and leaving entire nations to ask the same haunting question. How many warnings were heard and ignored before faith became a prison? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Eddie Long, a once revered figure in American megachurch circles, became a symbol of both spiritual influence and moral controversy. Born in 1953 in Charlotte, North Carolina, Long rose from humble beginnings to lead New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, one of the largest and most influential African American churches in the United States. With a magnetic presence, an authoritative preaching style, and an ability to connect personally with congregants, Long cultivated immense loyalty and trust. However, beneath this exterior of spiritual guidance lay allegations of exploitation and abuse that would challenge the perception of faith, trust, and pastoral authority. Long's ministry grew rapidly during the 1990s and 2000s, fueled by his compelling sermons, community outreach, and ability to inspire devotion among thousands. He emphasized prosperity theology, teaching that faith, obedience, and giving would result in both spiritual and material blessings. The message resonated deeply with congregants, many of whom sought hope, direction, and stability amid socio-economic challenges. Long's charisma and personal attention to members, combined with high-energy worship services, fostered an environment where he was both admired and regarded as infallible. By the mid-2000s, New Birth Missionary Baptist Church had grown into a sprawling institution, boasting tens of thousands of members, multiple campuses, and substantial financial resources. Long leveraged this influence to extend his reach beyond the local congregation, engaging in media appearances, publishing books, and hosting televised sermons. His public persona was that of a devoted pastor, a community leader, and a moral guide whose life exemplified the values he preached. However, in 2010, Long's carefully cultivated image was shattered by a series of lawsuits filed by young men alleging sexual misconduct, coercion, and abuse of authority. The plaintiffs, many of whom were members or former members of the church's youth and leadership programs, claimed that Long had exploited his position of spiritual authority to initiate sexual relationships under the guise of mentorship and guidance. The allegations were deeply disturbing, as they highlighted the ways in which power, trust, and religious authority could be manipulated to prey upon vulnerable individuals. The lawsuit sparked national outrage and intense media scrutiny. Reports detailed how Long's influence within the church created an environment where questioning authority was discouraged, and obedience was framed as a moral and spiritual imperative. Congregants were often taught to view Long's guidance as divinely inspired, which intensified the psychological impact on those alleging abuse. Critics emphasized that Long's dual role as spiritual leader and moral authority amplified his ability to manipulate trust, making the allegations even more shocking. Long initially denied the allegations, framing them as attempts to defame his character and undermine his ministry. However, the sheer number of accusers, combined with corroborating details and investigative reporting, painted a disturbing picture of systemic abuse. The lawsuits were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, leaving Long facing public condemnation, damaged credibility, and lasting questions about accountability in megachurch settings. The impact on New Birth Missionary Baptist Church and its congregation was profound. Members experienced disillusionment, anger, and betrayal, struggling to reconcile the pastor they had admired with the allegations of abuse. Long's personal charisma, combined with his institutional authority, had fostered deep trust, making the revelations of misconduct all the more painful. Psychologists studying the case emphasized the long-term emotional consequences for congregants, including feelings of guilt, complicity, and shaken faith, beyond the immediate legal and emotional fallout. Long's case sparked broader discussions about oversight, accountability, and the structure of megachurch leadership. Scholars and religious ethicists highlighted the dangers of concentrated authority in large congregations, where the pastor's word is often considered unquestionable and institutional checks are weak or informal. The case prompted calls for stronger governance, independent auditing, and formalized reporting channels to protect congregants from abuse of power. The Long scandal also prompted conversations about the intersection of prosperity theology, charisma, and exploitation. By linking material success and spiritual obedience, leaders could foster environments where questioning authority seemed incompatible with faith. Congregants eager to achieve spiritual and material blessings might overlook or rationalize unethical behavior, highlighting the psychological mechanisms that can facilitate abuse within religious institutions. Despite the scandal, Eddie Long continued to maintain influence within certain circles until his death in 2017, while some congregants remained loyal, citing his prior contributions to their spiritual lives. Others distanced themselves, reflecting on the betrayal of trust and the ethical failures exposed by the lawsuits. Long's story serves as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of faith communities to the misuse of authority and the enduring consequences of spiritual exploitation. The legacy of Eddie Long underscores a central tension in religious leadership. The power to inspire and guide can also be weaponized to exploit and manipulate. His life illustrates how charisma, institutional authority, and perceived moral infallibility can create a dangerous environment for the vulnerable. For survivors, families, and observers, the case offers lessons about vigilance, accountability, and the critical importance of separating personal authority from spiritual influence. Even years after the lawsuits and public scandal, Long's story resonates as a reminder that spiritual leadership carries immense responsibility. When that responsibility is abused, the emotional, psychological, and societal costs are staggering. Communities must balance respect for authority with critical oversight, ensuring that trust is never weaponized for personal gain or gratification. In the end, Pastor Eddie Long's life and ministry challenged the simplest assumptions about faith and morality. He preached salvation, guidance, and divine favor. Yet the allegations and legal settlements reveal a darker reality where trust was manipulated, authority was abused, and faith became a tool for personal exploitation. His story leaves an indelible mark on American religious life, a somber reflection on how those entrusted with spiritual guidance can profoundly betray the very people they claim to serve. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. The stories you've seen today reveal a chilling reality behind the sermons, the smiles, and the promises of salvation. Some pastors exploited faith for wealth, power, and personal gratification. From charismatic megachurch leaders to televangelists with national followings, these individuals manipulated trust, preyed on vulnerability, and left communities grappling with betrayal and disillusionment. Faith is sacred, but when authority is abused, the consequences are real, lasting, and devastating. Subscribe to explore more deep investigations into the hidden truths behind those who claim to lead with morality but act with deception. Like this video if these stories opened your eyes to the dark intersections of faith and power, and share to ensure others are aware of the warning signs and lessons these cases provide. Because when trust is weaponized, vigilance becomes a responsibility, and knowing the truth is the first step toward protecting yourself and your community from those who preach heaven but live in sin.